Mark, thank you so much. Always joy and pleasure to have you on the show. And I would like to start with Ukraine, predictably. We're getting more news as we speak about the counteroffensive Ukraine is launching. And based on what we're seeing and based on the statements the Ukrainian authorities are making, can we say that we're watching this new Black Sea military strategy in the making?
I mean, look, it's entirely possible. I think we have, at this very early stage, to be quite cautious in that individual military operations do not then necessarily mean a full-scale campaign. What is clear is that for a variety of reasons, the Ukrainians are very, very keen to try to regain momentum. I mean, after the Russians managed to take Luhansk, then there was a very real question about the capacity and the morale of the Ukrainian forces, because it's all very well providing military equipment, but the Ukrainians have been taking a lot of casualties, and increasingly they're relying on conscripts and relatively untrained troops rather than the very, very seasoned forces who really took the brunt of the fighting in the early stage. The Black Sea is going to be absolutely crucial, though, for, first of all, the Ukrainian economy. Secondly, it's a theatre where they can demonstrate that they actually can push back Russian gains. And thirdly, this is also about Kyiv demonstrating to the West that the massive investment in resources are actually going to be bringing some kind of a result. There is a real concern in Kyiv that Ukraine fatigue is setting in the West, and so they need to show some kind of movement.
We just heard from the foreign minister of Ukraine, Dmitry Kuleba, that Ukrainian authorities intend to return the lost territories and fully restore sovereignty in the east and in the south of the country. Is this intention pushing the war the end of the war rather, way back beyond what we were predicting at the very beginning when it was said that the campaign is not going to go beyond several months?
Look, you have to appreciate that politicians will say one thing, the battlefield may well say something very different. I mean, of course, the Ukrainians have to maintain the formal position that every single square inch and every single square centimetre of Ukrainian soil must be returned to Kyiv's sovereignty. In practice, we're going to have to wait and see. Just as, frankly, the Russians are also making very, very maximalist claims for what they're after. It will come down to, frankly, what the arithmetic of the battlefield demonstrates. There is clearly some thought that there might be a fallback position, which is essentially to take back the southeast, the Donbass region, but perhaps fudge a little bit on Crimea. And certainly that's a position that many of Ukraine's Western allies are quietly pushing upon it. So we'll just wait and see. Look, if the Ukrainians can pull that off, which I think frankly is dubious, then obviously they'll be happy. It's more a question of how well they position themselves. Because remember, a lot of this is actually about a process of implicit negotiation. Wars are about will, about the national will and the will of leaderships to continue fighting. This is about signaling to the West that Ukraine has the will to continue fighting, but it's also a signal to Putin saying, you're talking very bullishly, you're claiming that you're in it and you haven't even really started a fight and so forth. Well, we are determined to. We are willing to drag this war out and in the process bleed you dry. So there are a variety of audiences that are being presented, but this is about the political positioning of the war more than anything else.
Speaking about that statement of Vladimir Putin saying that they haven't even started in Ukraine, who do you think the audience for that message was?
I think obviously there's an element in which it was to the Ukrainians saying, basically this is going to get even bloodier for you. There's an element in which it was for the West to essentially say, are you really determined that you want to get involved in this? Because let's be honest, the West is also a combatant. It's just a different type of war that it's fighting. But I think it's also very heavily intended for the Russians themselves. This is as close as Putin can get to really acknowledging that he has to admit to the Russian people that what was intended as this short, victorious special military operation is in fact turning into a very long-term and ultimately expensive in economic as well as human terms war. So, again, at the moment, he's not willing to actually come clean and say, yes, this is a full-scale war. So he has to imply and suggest it to prepare the ground for the Russian population to come to terms with that.
So, in other words, Putin is trying to say that the war can drag on and people should be kind of fine with that.
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if he expects they should be fine with that, but yes, I mean, he's warning them that. And because after all, this comes at a time when we've also seen the Duma pass a package of measures, which essentially say that the state can activate the military economic mobilization plans, which are usually reserved just for a full-scale war, also in the context of a special military operation. So in other words, this is basically a war by any other name. And it means that people at strategic enterprises might find themselves being forced to do overtime, that companies may well not be allowed to refuse government contracts, and that mobilization stocks of economic resources and so forth can be untapped. So this is Russia already, frankly, moving to a wartime economy. And that's not something that you can keep concealed. So again, I think this is the political counterpart to those economic moves.
Speaking about public opinion in Russia, we're just finding out about this research and poll that was done by the Center of the Research of Public Opinion in Russia, and Medusa is reporting about the results. It hasn't been published on the FTIOM website, but basically it is showing a different picture to what we heard initially about the support of the war in Russia. Several months ago, we heard that more than 70% of people actually support that. And now we have a different picture. 30% of the people polled are saying that the war should be stopped immediately. Do you feel that when this research is given to the Kremlin, because it's the presidential administration who seem to have ordered that, the mood in the Kremlin will change?
Well, I mean, this speaks first of all to the basic question of what is Putin being told? I mean, that is, from the point of view of external researchers, the biggest question. We know what the objective data suggests. We know what is being discussed. We do not know what is in the briefing papers that end up on Putin's desk. And certainly, personally, I mean, that's what for me would be the holy grail. So we first of all don't know what Putin's perspective is. But I think the point is, look, this is not a regime which cares on the whole about what the public thinks, except insofar as that becomes an actual threat. I think, to be perfectly honest, Putin is now in a position where this war has become politically existential for him. He cannot back down. He needs to have something that he can claim as a victory. I think this is why there was this pressure on taking all of the Donbass. I think from Putin's point of view, if he could have taken all of the Donbass plus the Crimean corridor along the northern coast of the Azov Sea, he would then have been able to say, this was never about invading Ukraine. This was always about protecting the Russian speakers from pogroms carried out by those evil neo-Nazis in Kyiv, and now we can stop. The point is, at the present, though, he has, at best, a very mutilated victory. He can't claim victory. And therefore, he's stuck with this. So I suspect, unfortunately, that for Putin, assuming he sees this data, that is actually a reason to be putting more money into the National Guard and increasing the salaries of your policemen, getting ready to, if necessary, enforce your control over the country, rather than a reason to change tack, to change approach. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people other than Putin who haven't got this stake in the war, who are genuinely worried about what's going to happen to the future of the system on which they depend. So I think we might actually see a situation in which there are other, particularly the younger figures, the more technocratic figures within the administration, who are definitely worried about this trend. But Putin himself, I think he can do nothing but dig in his bunker.
So basically, we cannot imagine Putin right now watching CNN or just browsing social networks somewhere to see what exactly is going on. It's not in his character.
I don't think so. Well, I mean, let's be honest. This is a man whom we're told, at least, doesn't even have a smartphone. A man who believes that the internet was an invention of the CIA and is essentially just simply all about pornography. In that context, I think it's unlikely. I mean, this is a man who is very, very conventional and very monarchical in his approach to information. He expects paper dossiers brought by underlings to his desk. And the trouble with that as an approach is that it actually means that you become, in some ways, a hostage to those people who are going to draft those dossiers. And I think this is the thing we've seen, that Putin's strategy increasingly is based not on the real world that is out there, it is based on the rather artificial world that he's presented to with his documents.
And this kind of goes in line with all the news about, cases against people for fake news about the Russian army. We just saw Alexei Gorinov last week getting 7-year sentence in the penal colony. And now we're watching the case of Ilya Yashin unfolding in Russia. And he seemed to be just going down that path as well, fake news about Russian army. Considering the fact that there are few voices that are being publicly heard in Russia expressing their dissatisfaction, a lot of people actually have left. Do you feel that putting pressure on them is somehow more important for the Russian authorities? Because you could argue that there are few of those, you wouldn't even care about them.
Yes, I mean, what we're seeing is the Putin regime moving from the interesting postmodern hybrid that it once was, which used some repression and some spin to essentially win the narrative conflict for Russians. Now it's moving into much more what we think of as a kind of proper authoritarian model. And one of the key elements of that is to keep society atomized, to keep it fragmented, and to keep control of the narrative. Even if you can't get people to believe your story, at least you want to make sure that they're not exposed to alternative stories about what's going on in the world. So yes, we are seeing a pretty comprehensive struggle. I mean, we have seen the closing down really of the last truly independent media outlets in Russia. We've seen attempts to limit people's capacity to be able to access objective or just simply different news channels through the internet. And now we're seeing those people who actually speak out, whether they are relatively well-known public figures or whether they are just individuals who happen to retweet the wrong thing as far as the Kremlin is concerned at the wrong moment. The idea is really to stop people talking to each other. And in many ways, it's a return back to the Soviet model of information control. We know there will still be the kitchen table conversations. But the idea is that if you can keep all those conversations to the kitchen, you prevent the formation of wider protest movements. As I say, I mean, I think that the parallels with what we were seeing in the 1970s and the very early 1980s are really very pervasive and stark.
Moving out of Moscow, going to London, where you are, where it's really hot right now, just like in DC. We're watching the government crisis unfold, and it's for a bystander, it's difficult to understand all the details of the British politics. But Boris Johnson is stepping down. We're seeing the candidates for this position, and a lot of people are asking this question. Boris Johnson was known, and he was self-proclaimed best friend of Ukraine. Now that he's stepping down, will the UK change its policy towards Ukraine somehow? And will the amount of aid and amount of support decrease?
No, it won't. And I think there's two things. First of all, it was interesting that you used the word crisis, because one has to remember the British system is a parliamentarian rather than a presidential one. And much, much less actually depends on the identity of the Prime Minister. I mean, the government is still running and so forth. And I think that's one of the key points. Boris Johnson, a showman to the end, had managed precisely to present himself as the great champion of Ukraine. And look, I don't want to take that away from him. He absolutely leapt forward at the first opportunity and has been able to become a very sort of high-profile supporter of Ukraine, not just in terms of what Britain provides, but in terms of encouraging particularly European allies to also step up to that. However, it's worth noting that Britain has had a long-term commitment to Ukraine. I mean, we had Operation Orbital, which was a military training program that well predated this conflict and has been going on for years. We've had the fact that Britain was willing to send warships quite close to Crimea to challenge Russia's claim to control over its waters and such like. And in this respect, again, what Boris has been claiming credit for is in fact something that is widely held, I think, across the political spectrum. And it's interesting that we're seeing all of the major Conservative Party candidates, when they're discussing Ukraine, and we should stress that the real discussions are about things like taxation and so forth rather than anything else, but when they discuss Ukraine, they all emphasize their support for the continuation of the current policy. But in some ways, actually, although the Ukrainians are already mourning the loss of Boris Johnson as their great friend, actually this might be to their advantage. Because the thing was this: Boris Johnson had a tendency to make promises without really thinking about the costs. And he hadn't really managed to make the case to the British people why it was so important to defend Ukraine. I mean, generally speaking, there is a strong opinion in the UK across the different political parties and in the country as a whole of support for Ukraine's position. However, there is also a desire for more public spending. There is a desire for tax cuts. And that runs at odds with spending, what is a very substantial sum of money in supporting Ukraine. I mean, recently, for example, Boris Johnson pledged 1 billion British pounds in additional military support. Now, 1 billion pounds will buy you 2 brand new hospitals. And I think this is the issue. There was going to come a reckoning when people would say, yes, Ukraine is all very well, but what about our public services? And I think, therefore, a leader who is probably more willing to be honest with the population and more willing to actually be an effective guardian of public finances actually has a better chance of keeping a consensus in support of Ukraine. Because I think the big fear was, particularly come winter, when times are going to be hard and people are going to find their fuel bills very high, not entirely, but largely because of the conflict. And they're also going to be seeing a lot of money continuing to flow towards Ukraine, that they would begin to think, no, we're not happy with this. So actually, a more sensible leader with a more long-term policy and a willingness to be more honest with the population might actually be able to maintain this policy for longer than someone like Boris Johnson.
Mark, there is a talk in the United States right now about introducing better control over the military aid and how it's being distributed in Ukraine. There were a number of discussions about that, and we heard from Interpol earlier on that there are concerns that in the post-war period, the military, supplies that are being sent to Ukraine will start popping up in different parts of Europe and beyond Europe, actually, just because there is no effective kind of control over this. And in the White House, they're now saying that they believe that Ukraine would not let third parties to take hold of the military aid that is being sent. Are there similar concerns in the UK about this? And are there any suggestions about what should be done?
Yes and no. Yes, there are concerns. And look, inevitably, all wars create situations in which there's instability, a lack of control over inventory, borders become penetrated, especially when you have millions of refugees leaving a country and so forth. And so, I mean, there is a concern about the possibility for substantial criminal activity in wartime and indeed in a post-war Ukraine. However, at the same time, we have to realize that the market, the international criminal market, tends to be for small arms. It's for rifles, it's for ammunition, it's for rocket-propelled grenade launchers, that kind of thing. It's not for HIMARS missile systems or tanks or whatever. They're very hard to move, they're almost impossible to conceal, and more to the point, they require a huge amount of infrastructure to keep them maintained, to keep them supplied, to have the right ammunition for them and so forth. They're not the kind of thing that some warlord in some conflict zone can actually use properly. So I think that there is a degree to which this debate in the UK is rather different from the debate in the States. In the UK, as in most of Europe, it's not so much about a fear that the main sources, the main military equipment that are being transferred, which are all largely in the sort of the high end and large scale of things, are themselves going to get stolen. It is more a beginning of thinking about, okay, well, what are going to be the consequences? Either if this war becomes just simply a long-term sore, or whether actually, it comes to an end. How much of the aid that will be provided to rebuild Ukraine risks being stolen by corrupt officials or companies? How far are the flows of refugees actually being used also to conceal people trafficking routes? All these kinds of other issues relating to what we might call the underworld economics of conflict. So there are common threads, but in fact, the nature of the argument is really quite different on this side of the Atlantic.
On this side of the Atlantic here, Washington is watching the possible sale of drones to Russia from Iran. Iran so far is saying that nothing like that is happening. But I just wanted to look at the broader picture here and ask you whether Moscow has a lot of channels to rely on when it comes to replenishing its supplies of military equipment when it needs it.
No, not at all. I think this is really, I think, one of the very powerful long-term effects of the economic war that is being waged against Russia, is precisely that it cuts it off from the sources for absolutely vital components that it will need for its precision-guided missiles, for its drones, and so forth. It will continue to be able to produce the relatively simple kit. The unsophisticated tanks without night vision gear, Kalashnikov rifles, things like that, they can absolutely turn out. But the kind of high-end, high-tech potential sort of war-winning equipment, that's going to become increasingly hard, especially because, and this is crucial, the Chinese are not willing to help. The Chinese are still looking very much to avoid getting sucked into this. They don't want to be caught with secondary sanctions. They don't want to jeopardize their trade with the West. And therefore, they're not actually providing anything more than some very, very simple kit. So this is why the Russians are having to look as far afield as Iran.
So China is part of the Shanghai Cooperation for Security, and we are hearing that Iran is going to become officially part of it in 2022, essentially this year, and Belarus just announced that it's gonna join Shanghai Organization for Security. Do you feel that this is the alliance, this increasing alliance, is something the West should be worried about?
I think so, because it really emphasizes the fact that this is not just simply a conflict between Russia and the West. It is also, I think, speaking to the fact that there is a widening gap between the West and the rest. I mean, if one looks, for example, at how this war is being spun, read, and responded to in the global South, it's clear that although there are a few countries that were willing, for example, to put sanctions on Russia and vote against Russia at the United Nations, for many, they don't really care. They just see this as very much a Northern Hemisphere war. And in some cases, there are people who feel a certain amount of sympathy for Moscow, simply because they interpret this as an anti-colonial struggle. I mean, I was talking to someone who does a lot of business in sub-Saharan Africa, who was saying that what he was being told is that there are countries which are worried about being caught by American secondary sanctions, that if they do business with Russia, they find themselves under sanctions. And they are interpreting that as American financial colonialism. That basically the Americans are using their financial clout as muscle to force other people into their war, and they resent that. And I think this is one of the big failures we've had in the West. We have not managed to develop a narrative to the rest of the world that explains to them why it also matters to them. Because it does. I mean, this is actually a war about national sovereignty, about strong countries not being able to just simply impose their will militarily on smaller countries and so forth. I mean, there is actually a narrative there, but on the whole, we've neglected to address that. And I think this is why China is in many ways gaining. I mean, although at first this was a war that was inconvenient for China, especially because they have a lot of investments in Ukraine, and Ukraine is their biggest source of imported corn. And obviously that's not happening now that the ports are largely closed. But what they are also doing is the Chinese are in a position now in which they can basically present the West as warmongering and irresponsible. The Russians, they don't really have to care about, because the Russians need their support anyway. So basically they can do the Chinese can do whatever they want, and Russia will still be okay with that. And to the rest of the world, the Chinese can present themselves as being the grown-ups. And I think this is why we need to be concerned about this, not because the Shanghai organization is going to become some kind of military alliance like NATO with a single coherence, but that it is a symptom of a wider issue in which, at the moment, the Chinese are more effective in selling their own vision of the world than we in the West have been.
Mark, we're watching unlikely alliances forming. Maybe it's just temporary, but we're seeing that Washington is reaching out, for instance, to Venezuela, to Saudi Arabia to resolve the oil crisis, to help resolve the oil crisis. President Biden is starting his visit to Middle East, and he's actually visiting Saudi Arabia. Do you think this is going to be just a temporary fixture, or Washington will be trying to kind of solidify this connection with former outcasts like Venezuela, for instance, to just look forward and to try to isolate Russia even more?
I think that, I mean, it's in many ways, I think, a very deeply problematic policy to adopt. I mean, I can understand, and the pragmatism is obvious. You know, for example, Saudi Arabia. You know, America wants Saudi Arabia to be pumping more oil and charging less for it to undercut Russia's position in global oil markets. Same with Venezuela. Everyone understands that. However, this is, I mean, if you take Saudi Arabia, I mean, Joe Biden basically said that Saudi Arabia seemed to be wanting to make itself into a pariah state. And now all of a sudden, they're making nice. Likewise, Venezuela. The Venezuelan regime is no less violent, vicious, corrupt, and oppressive than it was 6 months ago. And yet all of a sudden now we want to basically make them our friends because, again, for short-term political reasons. This may work in the short term. It may help bring more pressure to bear on Russia. But at the same time, what it actually says is when the West talks about values, they don't really mean it. You know, it's just rhetoric, because if they think they need you, they won't care if you're a blood-soaked authoritarianism or not. And I think this is exactly the narrative that the Russians themselves have been pushing out, that they claim that, you know, the West, you know, that they're just hypocritical, aggressive, and imperialist, even if they don't wear pith helmets and actually try and plant their flag on your territory anymore. They're still trying to control you, and yet they will claim to be the good guys. So I'm worried about this as a policy. I think it may help in the short term against Russia, but in the long term, it further undermines the moral claim of any kind of Western position in the world.